Freedom Project Davos session, Ending Modern Slavery. The issue is serious and our panel have great experience in dealing with this topic. On the panel is Henrietta Fore, the Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Funds, UNICEF. Good to have you.
Thank you, Richard.
Arne Sorenson is the President and CEO of Marriott International. We'll be getting insight from you, sir, on how what Marriott's experiences are and how you believe you can help. Antonio Neri is the President and Chief Executive Officer at Hewlett Packard Enterprises. You're very welcome. And Gary Haugen is the Chief Executive Officer of IJM, the International Justice Mission.
Yes, sir.
You're welcome too. I think we need to start with you, Henrietta, for about the underlying state of affairs at the moment, the size, the scale of the problem.
Right. So children around the world, we feel 1 in 4 are in some version of child slavery. It's equal for girls and boys. And we think there are about 168 million. So part of the puzzle here, Richard, is to make them visible so that we can see them, so that we can find them, so that we can support them.
Gary Haugen, what do we mean, what do we understand as being child slavery?
Well, as a global problem of modern slavery, the ILO agrees that there's about 40 million people in slavery in the world today. They are working in agricultural facilities, they're working in rice mills, they're trafficked into brothels and the commercial sex industry. The basic definition is people who are forced to labor. And for children, they make up a significant proportion of this. About a quarter of that 40 million are children, and they will be in any of the places of forced labor that you can imagine.
So to be clear,
yeah.
we're not only talking here about what gets so much attention, for example, the sex slave industry, people being trafficked for that. We're not just talking about that.
Sex trafficking is about 25% of this 40 million who are held in modern day slavery.
The majority being, what?
Overwhelmingly women and children in the sex industry.
Right, but away from, being the non-sex slave industry.
Non-sex trade slaves are held in places of just common industrial activity. As I said, brick factories is probably the largest, but agricultural plantations, they're in domestic service, they're in fishing vessels. In Ghana, International Justice Mission is working on the largest man-made lake, where there are thousands of children held as slaves on small fishing vessels. More than half of them are less than 10 years old. So this can be small children. I was in the back room of a brothel in Cambodia years ago, and I was taken to a back room and shown a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age who were just on open sale to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. So in the dark, neglected corners of the world where children especially are exploited, you're going to be finding them in these horrific conditions of slavery.
So taking it from that appalling situation to Fortune 500 companies. Let's start, Antonio, first to yourself. Before we hear what you're doing, tell me why you became concerned and interested in this.
Well, as the panel is talking, this is a major catastrophe, and we as business leaders have a responsibility to take action. And Hewlett Packard obviously has been at the forefront of not just providing solutions to business problems, but also to societal problems. In fact, our purpose is to advance the way we live and work. And so myself as a leader of a renowned company, we have to take action. We have to stop this.
But you say, but where in your line, where in your company or your supply line would a company like Hewlett Packard Enterprises, where would you experience this? Because, you know, you are an enterprise assisting other companies. It's not like you're shipping things.
We do. We actually manufacture products, and to his point, right, is in the supply chain.
Whereabouts in your case?
In our case, it starts with understanding conflict minerals, where we procure minerals to manufacture components, where those components are built, the origins of that. what labor is being used to manufacture those components, ultimately all the way to the final products. So we held our suppliers accountable to a set of standards.
Arne, when did you become involved or interested in this?
Well, there are two pieces of this that I'd like to sort of distinguish. One is sex trafficking that may occur occasionally in hotels, and that is behavior that guests in the hotels are engaged in. And we want to make sure we're doing what we can to be alert to those circumstances and address them. That is not so much about slave labor working in our hotels, but we want to make sure we're also mindful of the fact that the working conditions for our people in our hotels must be acceptable. And think about, there are a number of countries in the world where the hotel labor is all imported. Take the Emirates as an example. The Emirati population in most of the Emirates is tiny. And so the workforce is going to come from the Philippines, or it's going to come from India, or it's going to come from various markets around the world. We have for decades said we actually put our associates above the customers because we can't get to our customers except through our associates. And so the quality of our associates' jobs must be strong if they're going to take pride in their work and deliver the kind of experience they need to have. So these two issues are, in my mind at least, quite different. They may come together for both of you because you're looking at much more global trends and
But often the person who may end up being trafficked or being abused as a sex worker in your hotels, that journey started somewhere,
Correct.
didn't it?
Correct.
And you are, to some extent, at the last point upon which the consumer-facing end of it.
Right. It could be consumer-facing, or it could be mid-journey, right?
Yes.
It could be a number of different circumstances that pop. And by the way, the stories are not necessarily what you first assume you're going to hear. So one of the stories last year, we had a young boy checking into a hotel with an older man. The associate thought to herself, this does not look right. This does not look like a father and son or a family relationship. It looks different from that. This was in Southern California. It was a California boy who was grabbed at a retail mall. This was not somebody coming out of the developing world who I think we think of always in the first instance as this, because that's where the numbers probably are the biggest. But this was a very local story of, again, with training and with sensitizing that associate, she could say, there's something wrong about this. I've been trained to think about it. I've been trained to know who I should call. I called them. And that boy was freed.
Can I just say a word about this? That the difference is not whether the various enterprises might have some bit of slavery in their supply chain somewhere or in their labor supply somewhere. The question is whether those that are willing to stand up and admit that this is a risk. And this is what these leaders are doing. They are at least here on the platform admitting this is a risk. The question of those who are staying below the radar and not even acknowledging the risk. This is the kind of leadership that will bring about change. Walmart, for instance, just entered into a partnership with us to address the risk of forced labor in their fishing supply. And so they were actually bold enough to pay for a prevalence study that actually benchmarked, well, how much slavery is there? And now they're working with the Thai authorities and us to actually get rid of it. That takes great courage for the business sector.
Right, but on that courage question, Antonio,
Yes.
When did you become aware of this? I mean, at what point did you decide not only we have a risk, but it is a risk and I don't want to be crass about it, but there's two sides. You know, one is we've got a risk and it could get out. Right. There could be a reputational damage here. And the other is, no, it's the right thing to do.
Right. So yeah, obviously, you know, we care about the reputation, but in this case, we care more about doing the right thing. And listen, we started this journey more than 10 years ago when we have a very intense focus on sustainability, winning the right way, standard business of conduct that we actually apply to our suppliers. And we do audits, right? And we actually actually publish reports every year on the state on this particular topic. Like also we publish reports on carbon emission and conflicting minerals. But I wanted to go to a point here in that scenario that he talked about it, the role of technology. Because in our case, for example, we are partnering with companies that are very innovative, where basically we can actually use latest technology to solve the identity of these specific cases. And the law enforcement today take too long to figure out human trafficking. And we have had very high success applying new technology in this space.
That's a fascinating area. I'd like to put that just to come back to on this, the law enforcement aspect. Henrietta, every company has a multitude of risks and demands upon it. Environmental, human relations, all of these. How do you at UNICEF, how do you basically say this one has to go up the agenda? This one cannot just rank pari passu with all the others. You know, I need to stamp my foot and say, no, this is more important, or equally important.
Yes, all right. So we tried very hard on this, and this happens to be our 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we're out advocating for children and for young people with the idea that if people become aware, the public awareness, that will make a difference. And then you know that almost every business leader has a family. And if they think about their own families, they'd like to do something about it. And what both of our business CEOs are saying is that they've changed the attitudes in their companies. They've actually trained their people on how to find this, how to look for it. And that's the first step. And then if we can also train our communities. I mean, in India, there are more than 230,000 communities in 17 states that are actually doing awareness campaigns so that you know that if you see a 5-year-old who's carrying burdens that are just too heavy, it's going to hurt their body as they're growing up, that someone will say that that's not right. And we don't do this here in our state, in our community. But 5 to 17 years old is a very important time in the growth and the life of a child. And we all have to see it. We have to say something about it. We have to have awareness.
But is there, I dread even this question, is there, in the public's mind, a scale of unacceptability, whereby at one side you've got the child who's working hard in the fields, maybe hard labor, versus the imprisoned child who's been forced into sex work. Now, that whole spectrum becomes one of slavery. How do you balance that?
Well, cultures can be different.
Exactly.
But most people feel that if children are abducted and either kept from their family for years on end or sold elsewhere so they never see their family, that is something that should not exist in any community anywhere in the world.
We can agree on that. Then you move, I'm trying to get over this side because I'm trying to get along this sliding scale, if you like, because you do end up with
We want no children on any part of your scale, Richard.
Right, but what I'm saying is the way we move this scale makes it more difficult in the local communities, where, for example, there is maybe an acceptance of child labor.
I think this is the false choice, actually, Richard, because all of these countries now have adapted standards that say, in our culture, this is not acceptable. In our culture, it's not acceptable to have children held as slaves, as families held as slaves. So yet we have 40 million of them. So it has to do with the enforcement of them.
By held as slaves, you mean what?
I mean people who are not free to leave the forced, compelled labor that they're involved in.
Right.
I'm not talking about metaphorical slavery. We had 2 clients recently whose hands were chopped off because they tried to run away from the slaver who was holding them. The boys who are held on those boats in Ghana in fishing, they are beaten if they don't do what they're supposed to. There's a lock on the door of that girl who's held in a brothel. So this is actually not sort of obscure and difficult to understand. There are 40 million who are held in literal slavery, more than in any other time in human history. There were there are more people in slavery now than were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not that we don't have resources enough to actually free everyone across the spectrum of human suffering. For those who are fundamentally, in 2019, held as slaves, when Abraham Lincoln 150 years ago was telling us that fight was over, I don't think anybody really can make the argument that this isn't high enough on the scale of moral urgency.
Right. Then you get to the stage where you end up with communities where children are being forced, as the ones you said. There's no lock on the door. There's no lock on the door, but the parents say, look, you're going down that mine, and I'm going to show you a tape in a moment that makes that point. There's no physical barrier, but the economic reality is that they're going to have to be pressed into that. Would you agree?
Yes, and that economic migration, I mean, we can see it in the Horn of Africa, we can see it in lots of places. So there are young people that are migrating. They're very vulnerable. They can be taken and they can be placed into labor. And it's because they need some sort of livelihood.
40 million is a large number. Is it large enough to shock the world?
I think if we could take the world, as the CNN Freedom Project is frequently doing, and actually take them to the places where people were held in slavery, no one would be confused about what should happen or whether we have the resources to do it. It's now illegal in every community and country. The question is whether or not those laws are enforced. And I will say the biggest impact that business can make in this era is to go to those government leaders and say, we love being part of economic growth in your country, but it would help us tremendously if you rigorously enforced your own standards against slavery.
Gentlemen, let's just pause for a moment and look at this report. This is from a CNN Freedom Project report from my colleague Nema Elberger, who was investigating the use of cobalt, which of course, as you know, is fundamental in the growing green economy. Well, you may all have a battery charger pack that's got it, but just watch where it came from and you'll see the significance of why our guests need to talk about it. Have a watch.
There is growing evidence that the cobalt supply chain uses child labor. Companies say they're working hard to verify the source of all their hand-mined, artisanal cobalt, but that it's a difficult task. We're here to follow the supply chain and see if we can do it for them. Before we set out, even the local governor warns us to expect to see children at work. We arrive at the Musonoi River mine, where the cobalt ore is washed to grind it down. Although we've been given permission to film here, as soon as they see us, officials begin to scare the children away. Not all of them, though, are fast enough. Some work on. One young boy staggers under his load. His friend sees the camera, and he drops his sack. They've clearly been warned. A mining ministry official spots this boy carrying cobalt has been captured by our cameras. His response is brutal. Later, we ask him why he struck the child. He refused to answer.
That is the sort of thing I'm talking about when I say you've got an area where forced labour, enforced labour in such a way, but without bars per se.
But these are circumstances that can be dealt with. There can be schools established and opportunities for those kids to attend, and a fair system of actually improving that artisanal mine situation so that actually they get a fair return on their investment, and there are standards for actually conducting those mining operations. This is boomtown mining exploitation, and it's not required.
For your industry?
Yeah, which basically, when our audit our suppliers and we find stuff like this, obviously, which is completely unacceptable, we don't procure those components.
Right, now, and let me be
to enforce the point of the government.
Let me be absolutely clear in this next question. I am not for 1 second suggesting that you don't check. But so let me. I'm asking for more of a wider response. The reality is this cobalt that we've seen, not just here but elsewhere, is being sold to brokers where there is no trail of authenticity, which one assumes gets into the vast commercial production procedures. How can you prevent yourself from buying that inadvertently?
Well, it starts by basically deploying the auditing processes all the way through the supply chain. At the beginning, you may not find it, but over time, you're going to get more intelligent, use the technology for tracking purposes, and then ultimately, you're going to get much closer to the source of the truth. But we have to start somewhere. Sitting on the chair and do nothing is not going to solve the problem. And that's why we have elaborated a very sophisticated supply chain, where I said before, we even track where the conflicted minerals are coming from. That's a perfect example, and make accountable both the suppliers we work with and the government that we are procuring from.
I understand your...
I was just meeting with the leading extractive industries who were pulling cobalt out of the DRC last night. That's one of the amazing things about the World Economic Forum. Those leaders are actually here. And they cannot be clear that the cobalt that they are producing doesn't have child labor in it. They can't certify that there aren't these kinds of abuses. But that doesn't mean it's not possible to set up a regimen by which that is cleaned up. And so it is a matter of consumers asking, where does they have to there's cobalt in, and all those electric cars you're going to be buying by the millions in the coming years, they're currently going to require cobalt in them to operate. And consumers asking, where does this come from? And pushing upstream then to the extractive industries the requirements that then they bring to those government leaders. Because you see, the government was actually present in that scene. But what was the government doing? It was hiding the problem rather than enforcing proper regulations. That can change, and we've seen it happen.
Arne, your industry obviously doesn't have that same sort of issue, but to the point you were saying about employees in some of your more remote hotels, and even, I suppose, the laundry, for example, that hotel sends out. Let's talk about the supply chain in that sense.
So there's a it sounds like cold words to use, but there's a supply chain of talent and there's a supply chain of goods, right? And your question sort of gets at both of them. The supply chain of talent is who are we hiring in these hotels? How do they work for us? How do we get them into our door, and how do we pay them? So two of the things we do is, one is it's a no-fee hiring process. Okay, so if you show up saying, I've got a dozen people who will work for you, and I'm going to charge you $1,000 a head to deliver those people to you, that's an immediate warning that there is something about this intake process that doesn't work. Similarly, if we're not paying the associate directly, that's a big problem. Follow the money, right? So if we've got I'll pick a hotel, 1,600 room Marriott Marquis in the United Arab Emirates. It's got workers from 60 countries around the world. We're going to pay, and maybe it's got 1,200 associates there. We're going to pay them all directly. And through those two tools, we establish a relationship with them, which is a very strong indication that they are there by choice. They are there because it's an economic opportunity that is compelling to them compared to what they would have had if they stayed home. They may be sending their money home, they may be there for a short period of time, but it's their choice, not somebody else's choice.
Let me push this to almost breaking point to understand where you consider your boundary to be, the extent to which you can do. You give a very good example of the employees, no fee, understand. But now let's say you send your laundry out to X's facility. Do you consider it part of your responsibility to ensure that X isn't employing child labor to do the laundry?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Same here.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that's why we live in this code that we have to think all that supply chain, no matter what role you play, because ultimately you're accountable to the final good, and the final good has all these components or whatever type of labor is being used.
So as that supply chain moves along, you get the laundry, Now you've got to worry about what the laundry's doing and the supplier to the laundry, and then the suppliers to the suppliers of the laundry, who goes out and picks, what I'm trying to understand, where does it end?
If I may.
Yes.
They can only do this with a certain amount of rigor, which these industry leaders bring to bear, which gets at a significant amount of the problem. But just as you're pointing out, if they're swimming in an ocean of impunity, if they're swimming in a national context in which these laws are not actually rigorously enforced, they are never going to be able to be sure that needle of forced labor is not in their haystack somewhere. And yet what they can do, and this is what I think business is starting to do, is get into conversation with government and say, we love being part of the economic growth in your country, but you need to prioritize enforcement within your country, even though the population is marginalized.
Go ahead.
So there's a penalty side to this that's very important, and there's another side which is, what's the root cause of it? So poverty is absolutely a root cause. Supply chains can be a root cause because of the economic side that they give. And the third one is conflict. And that they drive a lot of what's going on here. So in Nepal, for instance, the government released 1,900 children who that they felt had been inappropriately, illegally taken. They released them in. We began reintegrating them back into school. But having that enforcement side to it was very important. And all these companies, who are the best citizens in the world, sign up to principles and to rights. And groups like ours, we try to consult with businesses on what are the best ways to do that. But if we don't attack the root causes of poverty, of the conflict, we can't stop it, Richard. So that's something that everybody could do here at WEF. We could try to get to the root causes of poverty.
The moment you've gone to that route, which I think we could all agree is probably the long-term solution, but it's a feeling for everybody, go on, of being helpless.
I'm just going to challenge this a little bit.
Go on.
That it's sort of a similar mistake that sometimes we can make when we look at malaria. You would say 90% of malaria deaths occur amongst the very, very poor, so poverty causes malaria. Well, in fact, it's just that it's a malaria mosquito that causes malaria. And the poor just don't get protection from the mosquito larva that a person who's resourced does. So you always must have one thing in order for there to be slavery. You must have an enslaver. There is important things that UNICEF is doing to reduce the vulnerability of those populations, and that is very, very important. But what gets at the incentive of the enslaver? It's whether or not they think they're going to go to jail. So the Gates Foundation funded a project with us in the Philippines where we were attacking sex trafficking in a mega city. And we were able to, over a 5-year period of time, reduce it by, according to outside auditors, by 79%. Now, there wasn't significant reduction in poverty in that city, but there was a significant reduction or increase in the amount of risk that you'd go to jail.
So that is the carrot and the stick.
Yes. And you have to have both.
So think about jail and think about the economic opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So and by the way, there's some things we don't do, to be fair. We are looking very carefully at the things that we can influence and control, but are we separately assessing where the battery in my iPhone comes from? No, we're relying on Apple to make sure its supply chain is working, because they have influence over that supply chain in a way that we will never have.
Right.
But go back to this cobalt example. If we can use new data tools to track product in a way that, even without going to jail, causes the operator of that mine to know they're not going to sell their cobalt.
Right.
Because the users of that cobalt will view it as tainted goods. They will, by necessity, still chase the economic opportunity, but they'll decide we have to chase it in a different way.
Yep.
We've got to chase it in a way that satisfies Antonio, that
That's why
he's going to buy that product.
Yeah, and I think it starts with transparency. It starts by speaking up. It starts by partnering. Is both at the government level, at the societal level, and it starts by really using the new tools that we have today.
What tools?
Well, today, listen, Richard, we generate today 18 zeros of data today in everything we do.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't.
18 zeros of data in everything we do in our lives. 2 years from now, we're going to generate twice the amount of data we generate in entire human history. that data has tremendous value. And we're using this data now to solve societal problems, find cure for cancer, find other things like improving agriculture, finding a problem like that, and putting that technology to bear to try to contain and improve this specific problem. AI is a great component of this. We actually partner with an awesome company to the point made before. Young people really care about this. And I'll give you a great example. There is a company called Marriott, a startup, and a young lady, 25 years, that once was traveling to the Middle East and saw a girl being kidnapped and being sex abused, and she made it a personal cause to stop human trafficking for sex. And she started this company that is a software-oriented, using AI tools with our technologies, and empowering the law enforcement to track these traffickants that ultimately are put in jail. So there is things we can do today, not waiting for 5, 10 years from now to take action.
Does blockchain...
Absolutely.
I can't believe I'm using this. Let's get out. Does blockchain offer potential
Absolutely.
to create a supply chain integrity?
Absolutely, because it's a secure way to share information, right, across the globe and across businesses and across governments to really share the power of that data in ways that we can take proactive actions. Absolutely. So you have a blockchain, you have high computational power, you have now face recognition, you have AI algorithms that can all be applied to solve this problem.
Just last night, this discussion with the leaders of extracting minerals in Africa, we're talking about using blockchain and the way they'll be able to trace those elements through the supply chain. And huge success has been made, for instance, in diamonds. Used to be terrible problems with conflict diamonds, but now because of applications of technology and rigor and consumer pressure, now you can really quite confidently go find yourself a good diamond now.
And by the way, sorry.
In Davos, I'm told that's not difficult.
And by the way, there is another piece of this that we sometimes forget. We call this the circular economy, which is also to reduce waste over time. Because all what we produce eventually gets wasted somewhere. And we believe we actually can reduce waste as well throughout this engagement.
Well, and to Arne's earlier point about paying people individually, I mean, sometimes in these situations, it's a father who brings a son to the mine, or an older brother, or a sister who encourages. But if you can pay the person directly, then you know who it is that's getting the money.
Correct.
And that will be a big help. And a lot of it's biometric, and we're getting to the point now, we're starting to get identities. I mean, it isn't everywhere now, but it's started, and that's going to be very important.
Let's pause and see if any of our guests would like to ask a question. Oh, we're off to the races before we've begun. I always think it's so important to have your discussion, particularly on a nice, relatively intimate room like this. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Carl Peter Toros. I belong to the trade union, and I just want to scale up some of the things you're saying. One of the bigger problems we see is migrant workers. It's about 225 million migrant workers in the world today. And there is actually also cases where very rich country, by, for instance, in the Gulf states, kafala system, mistrust people, and a lot of them will end up in slavery.
And what are these migrant workers?
Migrant workers, 225 million migrant workers in the world today, and a lot of them end up in slavery. And it's not only in developing countries. Also in Sweden, one of the richest countries in the world, we have a lot of berry pickers, blueberry pickers, and we bring them from Vietnam, from Thailand, and sometimes, obviously, when they come to Sweden, they will not even get paid for the ticket. So that's modern slavery also in Sweden. It's really tough, and I think you have to take the rich countries first.
On that point, Gary, I mean, the blueberries have to be picked.
Yeah.
And as in the United States is discovering, has discovered for many years with its avocado industry and the California fruits and vegetable industry, domestic populations don't want to pick it.
Yeah.
Therefore, the migrant population is essential.
Yeah. But that is not a lost cause, and this is where business has such an important influence. In Thailand, again, the fishing industry attracts migrant workers from 7, 8, 9 nations surrounding, but they are held substantially in a business that then is focused in Thailand. The business community, Walmart in this particular case, has gone to the authorities and said, this is really important that you take your responsibility seriously, because even though these migrant populations are not politically important inside Thailand, So they're going to be marginalized, and the government's not going to respond as urgently. But when business says this matters to us, then the enforcement efforts become rigorous.
So I've covered this for a few years now. One of the things I would discover is that the governments may be good, they may be bad, they may be corrupt, they may not be. But business is pardon the bluntness of it, but business is the key to this. Business, getting business on board, Arne, and yourself, is the key to making serious progress. Would you agree?
I agree, but also the business has to be rewarded too, in the sense that there has to be a system where when we take action by applying leadership, by being transparent, by working hand-in-hand with the government, there should be a reward system that basically actually incent the business to come forward.
What sort of reward? Hang on, what sort of reward?
It's just, just basically stating these companies are the companies we want to do business with in our country. It has to be a monetary reward. It has to be rewarded. For example, 2 years ago, we won the award in this specific area, right? It's something we take pride of it because our employees feel they're working for a company that actually is making a difference.
Is there you're thinking about that?
I'm not sure I want to pick an argument here, but you asked some minutes ago about why do businesses do this, and sort of what's the motive, what got you into it. I actually don't think there's any inconsistency whatsoever in trying to take care of your people, try and take care of the communities where you do business, and make money. We're not trading one off against the other. We can't make money unless our people feel motivated to work well, and they're not going to feel motivated to work well if we've taken advantage of them.
But if
in the sex trafficking space, again, it's a small space as it impacts our hotels. We've trained 500,000 people. We never stopped and said, what does it cost us to train 500,000 people? By the way, they all come to our hotels every day. It doesn't really cost us anything in a way. They're coming to work anyway. This is one thing we can communicate to them to be mindful of. And every one of them feels better about their work by being trained in this space, by feeling that they have an expertise to watch out for something which is horrific. And for those who somehow were engaged in saving somebody, they'll take pride in that for the rest of their careers. They'll say, I saved that 12-year-old boy. And that, does it give us a reward or benefit? I suppose, because they'll feel proud of their work. But you don't have to stop and sit there and say that WEF gave us a gold star, or that we could specifically track that to the profitability of that.
I agree, that's not the motive, but the ability to follow on the idea, and to hear anybody join in, the recognition that Marriott is doing something about this.
That's right.
It may not be a requirement, but it is certainly an incentive for others to join in.
The training we developed, we have given directly to our competitors.
Really?
Really.
Much of this is pre-competitive in many respects, for industries needing to address these problems that they need to get dealt with even before they compete.
But the reward aspect, because it is important in terms of...
I think consumers will eventually be rewarding them, but what we have to make sure we're not doing is penalizing the responsible industries who say, yes, there is a risk and a problem. Because what has been happening over the last several years is that companies have been afraid to even appear on panels such as this because they're afraid to even suggest to consumers that this is a potential problem. We must get over that, and these leaders are helping.
About 10 years ago when I first started doing this, we did a story on this, and we almost had nobody in the travel and tourism industry that wanted to talk about this. Do you worry that, however good this is, you get a tag Marriott, oh yes, they're the ones that have to do work on sex trafficking, even though we all know that everybody else needs to be... Is there a downside in your to it?
Oh, I don't know. I think the upside is much more powerful than the potential downside. I guess the downside is that if you talk about it, you're telling people who may not have thought about it that sex trafficking may occur at hotels, right? If somebody has never opened their eyes to that possibility, you're telling them something about it. But on the other hand, again, think about our internal community of people. If they are motivated to get after this, which they are, there's a huge positive there. It may not be something that's calculable in terms of dollars and cents, but there's a huge positive there. And I'd much rather the world thought, if you're going to be engaged in sex trafficking, don't dare go to a Marriott hotel, because they have expertise to stop it. And if the whole industry can have the same set of tools, and you basically say, you've just now made 400,000 hotels globally, or whatever the number is, places where it's harder to do this bad conduct, well, that will also be, on some measure, a way to reduce the bad conduct. It might not make it disappear tomorrow.
No, it won't, but it's progress, yes.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce Arne's point, this is about your culture, your values, what you want to stand for, and ultimately reflect on your brand, right? And please take pride on that.
We've got somebody, yes, at the back, and then to the front, and then to the, well, we'll work out.
Thank you very much. My name is Hassan al-Dawadi. I'm actually in charge of delivering the World Cup. Nice to see you again, Henrietta.
I'm sorry?
I'm in charge of delivering the World Cup in Qatar in 2022.
What, personally delivering it, or?
Well, if you want personally delivering it, I don't think that's my role. You get somebody more interesting than me.
Excellent.
But I'm actually in charge of mainly the construction or for the stadiums, stakeholder engagement in terms of infrastructure, and leaving a legacy. Now, of course, I think it goes without saying that we've been in the spotlight over the last 10 years, specifically on this particular topic. And the great thing is, we've utilized the transformational power of the World Cup in terms of making progress. Now, we can debate the extent of progress, but progress has been made. And one of the success stories for us, one of the success factors has been, as you correctly pointed out, it's a combination of government agencies working together and companies working together. Right. It's never going to be one or the other.
Okay, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate you standing up and addressing this, but the World Cup in Qatar has had a dreadful reputation.
It started off that way, yes.
No, for these issues.
It started off that way, yes. We had criticism on that matter. But again, the World Cup in Qatar has allowed the spotlight to be brought on a topic, and reforms have been made where even the biggest critics, just let me finish this, even the most ardent of critics who've criticized Qatar on worker welfare standards has come to recognize that progress has been made.
So,
and let me just address one specific point.
I've got some specific question. So to Arne's point,
yes.
The ability for you to say, we've had problems, have dealt with them, and we are happy.
We're dealing with them.
And are happy to talk about that.
Yes. You have to be. To address this issue,
That's the
to address
point.
this issue, you have to be open, you have to be honest with what's in there. You have to be also, you have to have the capability of listening to the criticism, looking at what problems are, and addressing the problems as they are, not necessarily as per the criticism. One of the issues that we faced, and I faced personally when I met a lot of the NGOs, was you need to solve X, Y, and Z now. And solving them now is impossible. Just like you mentioned, going to the supply chain today to address the entire supply chain is an impossibility. But if you're confident about it, if you're committed to it in the long term, to fix the solution in the long term, then you will be able to
I understand that. I mean, just one final point on this, since you have raised yourself, though. There are some things you can fix very easily, as indeed I know Qatar has done.
Yes.
Making sure passports aren't removed, ensuring proper remittances. If people want to leave, ensuring that they can do so. Reducing the number of hours that they have to work in over 45-degree, 40-degree temperatures. Are those the sort of improvements you're making?
We're going beyond that. We're going beyond that. There were the immediate issues that you needed to resolve immediately, which we addressed and resolved immediately. But we're going beyond that, to the extent that today, I'm very proud to say, we are considered a benchmark in relation to recruitment.
So when I visit, you'll be happy to show me.
I will show you, but I just want to point out one thing, Richard. When we're talking about modern slavery today, one of the biggest issues is recruitment fees. I know Hewlett Packard is doing a significant amount of work on that. But recruitment fees forces people into labor.
Excuse me.
Today, my organization has applied a universal payment system whereby we're paying within the next 3 years over $22 million to workers who have had to pay recruitment fees. Now, the reason this is a successful story is because we changed the concept of you have to prove that you paid recruitment fees to putting the burden on the companies themselves to pay it off.
Yes, sir.
This is the breakthrough moment. The person who's responsible for a significant event that is a problem, has risks, seriously, of modern-day slavery, stands up and says, we have risks, and we invite consultation and engagement. No, we're not perfect, but we are working on it. That's breakthrough. Now, what also needs to happen is NGOs need to mature to the place, I think, where it's not just the exposure of the problem, but a partnership to help say, okay, here's some expertise that we can actually help train. We worked with UNICEF where they helped us train more than 10,000 law enforcement in India to actually effectively enforce the law. We can all work together to actually make this work.
So when you are exposed to the truly awful, you also have to be prepared to walk with it if that person says, I'm wanting to start changing. Would you?
Yes, absolutely. It's essential to try to help each other. We're trying to make the world better. So when there are companies or World Cups that need help, we're there to help. And I think everybody needs to be, because part of this, Richard, is education. It's just what Arne would be doing, you know, so that when customers come in, when we check into a hotel, that we actually think about it, that we look around us. We look around us in our communities. If we're not aware of it, then it won't get solved.
Another question. Yes, ma'am. Have a microphone.
Hello, I'm Sharon Prince, and Chair and President of Grace Farms Foundation. I worked actually with a number of you on the panel. I want to commend you in the back for the work you've done in Qatar, but here at the World Economic Forum, we have the opportunity to get ahead of it. Once you know, you can't unknow it. And so to say that any corporation, you too are commendable, but every single corporation knows it. I've talked to many of them. They know they have a risk, and this is the time to get ahead of it. Blockchain technology, the ESGs are very
Do you find that they're willing to? Or,
yes,
or is there a sort of a, yes, this is very, very important? Now,
yes. Well, I'll tell you one thing. So I signed an MOU with the Prime Minister Mamouka Baghtazi just a couple months ago in Georgia. And he is getting ahead of it. He is actually looking at driving economic development in Georgia by including removing the imprint of slavery. And we're looking at 2 discrete supply chains, agrarian, that are important to them. So I'm saying there are, that's the combination of using government.
But he's getting ahead of it.
Right, I'm just saying get ahead of it. This is what I'm proposing for World Economic Forum. This is one panel, and I've been here for 3 years. This is the second panel, and this is more primary. This is the first time. And this is the opportunity for corporations to actually have the strongest lever.
And on that point,
I will affirm the fear is real, that yes, you find leaders stepping forward and there are more of them, but that fear is real, that of acknowledging the problem, bringing scrutiny your way. So this is something that it needs to be outweighed by the fear of consumer response to something different.
And this is a legitimate issue for WEF, because it is one of those few occasions when business, government, and NGOs, people like me.
And also, can I ask just one other thing too, with the consumption trends? I saw a panel yesterday on consumption trends, and it really is Generation Z that's already acutely aware of ethical transparency in supply chains. So it behooves businesses to get ahead of it, and there should be a way to acknowledge that.
Is there any evidence? I can see evidence in terms of a hotel. Is there any evidence that anybody has thought about this before they buy a computer or a piece of technology? Do they ever sit there and say, I'm not buying that because I don't know where the lithium battery or where the chip was made?
I think it's growing. Absolutely, it's growing. But that's why we are on a journey here, and we need to raise the voice and continue to deliver this message.
But would you start trumpeting the fact that if I buy your computer, that you can be sure, the kite trademark on the back, you can be sure that every
Not 100% today, but that's what we're working towards. We have to work towards that.
We've spent years surveying customers about one thing or another, sustainability issues for 10 or 15 years, something like that, and trying various things to see how customers react. And I think it is crystal clear that the survey data will say that people prefer companies who are doing positive work in sustainability or in human trafficking, human slavery, et cetera. I think it's also fairly clear that most consumers, when they get to their consumption decision, are not thinking the way they thought when they filled out that survey. They're in a Best Buy where they've got a range of choices, and they're looking at the processing speed and the cost and the looks and all the rest of it. And so not to suggest that the consumer shouldn't be engaged. They should be. We all should be engaged as consumers. But much more powerful is if HP doesn't buy the cobalt that was done through slave mining, because they're the consumer of that cobalt.
That's a very, right.
And they have power because they're buying that cobalt in mass. Just as we're the consumer of the laundry services, to use that example you used before, we can go see the way that laundry is operated.
Can I add
And
another?
we're the
So
only
the
ones.
only thing
It's
I
not
would
our
add-
hotel guests are going to say, where did you get your pillowcases?
The only thing I would say, there is more awareness. Just an example. I spoke to this about another conference about sustainability. When you compete for business today, we compete in enterprise business, not in the consumer business. More stringent requirements are built in the RFP process, which is basically a procurement process, to basically come forward with specific aspect about sustainability. It can be where you procure your minerals, where you are building your products,
Yes.
or where actually what are you doing to reduce carbon emissions. All those requirements have now been hard-coded. It's growing. It's not there 100%, but it's growing.
I'm going to, another
Just
question.
a quick point about another point of competition is these companies are the best, and as Sharon's pointing out too, are competing for talent, especially the new generation. And when I go speak with the elite firms in the Silicon Valley, they are worried that if their supply chains get tainted, the best talent won't want to go work for them.
We have 10 minutes left. I want to get to as many questions as we can. Yes.
Okay, we've addressed Fortune 500 companies with fabulous products, good prices. Now I want to address the big market that India has for substandard products, which are $10 for a cell phone, $1 for medicine, which sells for $20 in the States. These industries, which make small plastic toys, we have hundreds and hundreds and millions of children working in India, which produce products which you don't know the name of. You don't know their names. So I want to address those companies which don't have your names.
So in that case, isn't it the relationship between yourselves and the governments in that country to introduce the laws, but how do you ensure the enforcement?
Well, and the truth is most labor-produced products never enter the international stream. They stay at home. But and that actually why it's not necessarily the international NGOs are not as critical as the local community NGOs and leaders who say in our nation, in our community, we're not going to tolerate this. This must be owned by the people of India, the people of whatever country is struggling with a burden of forced labor.
But is there a case to be made that says if the big industries are behaving like this, then it becomes harder for the smaller ones to get out to, because the spotlight can go more clearly? If we're not worried about what you're doing, we can spend a lot longer worrying about what you're doing.
Ours is very simple. Ours is they just want to make a cheap product.
Right.
Everything is about cheap. And they sell.
One more question. Two more questions then. These two ladies. First and then there. Yes, first here.
Anjara Jackson, a physician from the U.S. My question really has to do with what percentage of this problem is domestic slavery, of forced domestic labor, and how do we address that? Because there is no supply chain. That's a hidden form of forced labor and or slavery, which is
By domestic, you mean to where?
I mean in homes, like in people's homes.
Oh, you're talking right. So domestic service.
Yeah, domestic services, yes.
It's a significant percentage. It would be less than 10%, but it's a very significant percentage because that's exploitation that takes place at a community level, and it's very hard to know what is going on. But if there is rigorous, the beautiful thing about deterrence is that you don't have to go get everyone who's tempted to do this. But if there are a few enforcement actions where you see somebody went to jail for that, it's amazing that how quickly that spreads throughout the community.
That's a government thing then, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Prosecutorial. Right,
Yep.
yes.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Chihata from Enigma Magazine in the Middle East. First, I want to commend you, Richard, and CNN for making us all think about this topic. But in practical terms, especially in a region like ours where transparency is not that common, how can we as consumers who really care about this topic even find out if a business is compliant in those terms? Because we all talk about this, but we don't really know how to follow up on it, even if we want to.
It's a perfect question for us to finish on. Thank you. the question I'll put to you is, in this industry, where industry and business and commerce is concerned, are businesses the key to success, to true long-term success in dealing with this problem where NGOs and governments can only go so far, but industry speaks with true power?
Industry has a lot of power and has a lot of voice, but it's not all of it, Richard. The government has to be part of it, and the community. I mean, just each one of you have to be helpful with your neighbors and what's going on in your communities. So it's part of it. So it's maybe 1/3 of it.
A third. That's more than most people would think. I mean, you know, a third is pretty strong stuff.
Yes, and it's capable. I mean, it could do lots more.
Arne.
I don't think business by itself will solve this issue, but I want to try and answer the question in a way. As I mentioned, we've trained 500,000 people in our hotels to be observant to sex trafficking and other similar stories. That training is not revolutionary. That training is, here are a few things you should keep your eyes open for. And if you see one of these things, use your judgment, get to somebody who has expertise and authority and try and figure it out. As consumers, we can do the same thing. If we're in a restaurant, we're in a hotel, we're in a place where people are serving us, be attentive to them. Read them, figure out whether or not they are working in the condition that they feel good about working in.
And do what if you find it wanting?
Don't go there. Or say something to somebody.
Right.
Or maybe both. I mean, it's going to use your judgment and figure out what is it I'm seeing. And obviously that doesn't mean just if you found one person who's unhappy that day that you're going to necessarily call in the police. But it does mean if you're sensing an environment which is unhealthy and you're attuned to that and you use your judgment, there are steps that we can all take. Now, by the way, that doesn't get to the domestic hidden person. But there may be something before the domestic lands in that house too, which is an agent who's delivering that person to that house. And how do you get after that solution? But a lot of this stuff is just we've got to keep our eyes open.
Right.
And when we see something that doesn't feel right to you, it probably isn't right.
I think if we want to solve this problem, we all have to take responsibility. You have to speak up. It starts with transparency. It starts with partnerships. It is a collaboration between the business, the communities, and the government. And it's all about leadership.
Gary, you get the last word. Just listening to the extraordinary discussion today and the involvement of so many people and the progress that's been made, I'm not suggesting we should be complacent, but you must be heartened that the battle is adjoined on so many sides.
Profoundly. We've been working on this for 20 years now, and I've never been so hopeful. I think this is a generation that could actually see, for the first time in human history, the end of slavery as a force in human affairs. There will always be the odd crime that takes place, but as a force in our global economy, we could end this in our lifetime. Because we're not talking about thousands, we're talking about millions. Why are there millions in slavery? Because there's places where you just don't get in trouble for doing this. And in this era, the authorities who are responsible for enforcing it, yes, they listen to NGOs, yes, they listen to government intervention, but they listen more acutely to business than any other voice. And I think that's why the linchpin will be business in this era.
And that's your panel. Thank you.